going to introduce Shilpa and Saba. So before, I just have a few things I'd like to say. As defined by the organizers, this panel addresses how art might function as an infrastructural material or medium. Prompted by the formulation of this idea, artists Saba Innab and Shilpa Gupta will discuss their respective projects, which are focused on the specific geographical, political, and social conditions that inform their individual areas of research. On the one hand, Innab's work as an artist and architect sheds particular light on the built environment and temporary structural logics that serve as a reality for the 5 million Palestinian refugees spread throughout Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, Gupta's research, as part of a broader project, and since 2011, has been focused on the state of the India-Bangladesh borderlands along a roughly 4,200 kilometer border as a location of permeable separation between the two countries. I will let Innab and Gupta present separately on these topics as they relate to specific case studies and examples from their output, but would only like to take this opportunity to consider how thinking about their work has fostered a response from me and led to a series of general, perhaps unanswerable questions, which is why I thought to formulate them now instead of after, to save them from having to answer unanswerable questions. At the heart of Innab's and Gupta's working practices is a nuanced relationship to social reality and aesthetic artifice, and by extension, the official and the unofficial, the permanent and the temporary, the structural and the informal, which are so often reflective of artistic methodologies that provide access to hidden, withheld, or otherwise inaccessible experiences or truths. Earlier today, Innab mentioned that her work is motivated by, quote, an investigation of sites of personal and practical knowledge. And the questions that emerge from this, for me, are how do our own individual experiences of such forms of investigation lead to a further transformation of a given order? How are we able to access not only places and conditions that are foreign to our respective subject positions? How are our encounters with works of art bred from these processes, and how do these encounters leaving a lasting mark on our understanding of the world and the frames of individuated experience that define our respective senses of being in the world? Whether recognized as such or perceived as an invisible force, infrastructure is at the basis of all artistic work, and by extension, our apprehension of art. What are the dynamics of power and exclusion that remain as essential parts of the infrastructures of art? Historical narrative, discourse, the art market, exhibitions and display, collections and archives, curators and gatekeepers, aesthetic sensibilities, qualities of taste, good behavior, and the like converge to provide a kind of infrastructural context for artistic activity. The manifestation of ideas, it turns out, relies upon these networks of support as much as they rely upon a resistance to them. It's a trusting relationship, a binding contract that affords an ability to paradoxically undermine the very same structural order that defines artistic purpose and provides the agency needed to produce. If infrastructure can be an artistic material, a reflection of informality and refusal, then we must also see how art is itself a byproduct of many infrastructural conditions that impart themselves upon us, whether we like it or not. So, I'll first introduce Shilpa, who is currently living and working in Mumbai. Contemporary artist Shilpa Gupta works across a range of mediums, from video and interactive computer-based installation to performance. She is interested in perception and the process of transmitting and understanding information. From 1992 to 1997, Gupta studied sculpture at the Sir J.J. School of Fine Arts in Mumbai. She has since exhibited widely, including exhibitions at such venues as Karlskirche in Kassel, the 2017 Kathmandu Triennial in Nepal, the Mori Art Museum, Tokyo, the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Humlebæk, Denmark, the Musée de Design et d'Art Appliqué Contemporain in Lausanne, the 12th Havana Biennale in Cuba, the Guangdong Museum of Art in Guangzhou, China, the 8th Berlin Biennale in 2014, Sharjah Biennial 11 in 2013, the Arnolfini Center for Contemporary Arts in Bristol, the 2008 Yokohama Triennial, 2006 Liverpool Biennial, and more. Saba Innab, currently living and working in Amman and Beirut, is a Palestinian Jordanian architect and urban researcher whose practice departs from architecture as a multidisciplinary practice. Through drawing, mapping, model making, and design, her work is concerned with variable notions of dwelling and building as both temporary and permanent states, and their political, spatial, and poetic implications in language and architecture. She received her Bachelor of Architectural Engineering from Jordan University of Science and Technology in 2004, and has since exhibited widely in such contexts as the 2017 Biennale d'Architecture d'Orléans, the 6th Marrakesh Biennial in 2016, Homework 7 at Ashkal Awan in Beirut, and the Museum of Modern Art, Warsaw, among others. So first, we'll have Shilpa join us on stage. Thanks.
I need someone to help me with this button. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Sharjah Art Foundation for inviting me here today. It's been really an enriching 2 days to absorb so many intense thoughts and propositions. Thank you to you all. So I'll start. What I'm going to do is speak a little bit, and since the other panelist is not around, I think I've taken in a little extra time. So I hope I don't go on too much. Yeah. A name that is hard to let go, even though it slipped out of public records 2 decades ago, is Bombay. The city I grew up in lives with a new name. Bombay became Mumbai in 1996 when the right-wing fervor loomed heavy in the air. It was 4 years after the sectarian violence of 1992, which had begun to wedge itself into a country that had chosen to stay secular by its constitution. I remember sitting in a VT Bandra local train that had halted midway, not knowing when and if it will move, making rough guesses of the distant muffled sound being that of another blast. There was less ambiguity in the nature of this sound and little time to pause in Srinagar, while joining in to carry buckets full of water to wash off bloodstains on the street, a routine task after yet another rupture. 16, 18, 21, 17, 22 years. Upon walking through a graveyard where so many young people lay, those who are called either militants or martyrs, one realizes that definitions depend upon from where you're looking at. The weight of lines on paper is carried most by those who stand where they get drawn across. I studied a long time ago, 20 years ago, at the Sir J.J. School of Art, taking a daily train to the main city center, looking out of the window, seeing dense imagery flicker, be it billboards, television labels, and newly laminated identity cards, as they all jostle for space in a post-liberalization frenzy. The name of my street was changed. The sign now reads the new Guru Nanak Road, though even today if you ask for directions, it's most likely that you will get a quicker response if you use the older Turner Road. The computer was very new once, which I became intrigued by. Go to, start, enter, command, press, enter. The then new language of systemization. The row of compact Xerox shops on my street added the dot matrix printer, then inkjet, and started to quicken what the carbon paper could do. I've always been intrigued by the urge to authenticate, duplicate at will, and control. and classify. Perhaps the anxiety around such exercises that seek to enact codes and rules stand as acknowledgement of the limits they hold, and in turn become harbingers for slippages for leaks. So just sort of run in through a few works and then sort of move to the India-Bangladesh works that Aram mentioned. So in this work, I asked 100 people to draw a map of India, and none of them matched. The ongoing 100 hand-drawn map series are tracings of maps collected, layered on top of each other, using carbon paper, one of the oldest techniques to replicate and authenticate an agreement, a promise. I'm interested in agreements and promises and expectations, those that can be kept and those not quite so. Lines, lined, stand in a line, hands up and check, turn around and check, bend down and check. The viewer stands on the bricks and walks, puts on the headphone. Speaking wall is an interactive work. There's a sensor embedded in the wall which measures the distance between the viewer and the wall and accordingly triggers the audio. It tells the viewer to step back, step forward, step back a little, as it cannot see the border, as it rained last night. I'll play a short video. Can you help me play this? I'm not familiar with the Mac, sorry. This one, just play this video. Press the play. Step. Step away, one step. Step away, one step. Step away, one step. Stay. I am the wall in your house that you are unable to see. You walk past me and may never know. You came, you took, you left. I continue to bleed. Step a bit closer. Step a bit closer. Step a bit closer. 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 But you're still unable to see me. And the distance is convenient. Beyond the screen, you really don't have to know me. One step back. 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 One more. One more. One step forward. One step forward. Move forward. Okay, fine. Now you're no longer stepping on the border. Are you not able to see it? It is on the ground below you. The wind shifted it by a few centimeters. One step forward. So it's fine. So I no longer need your ID, no longer need to know your name, your religion, your sex, and the place you come from. Step a bit closer, a bit closer. Step a bit closer. Is the place you come from the place you were born, or the place you grew up, or the place you inhabit? Virtually, mentally, philosophically, physically. Step away, one step. When I was in Lahore in 2003, I was being driven by a friend to the Wagah border post. On the way back in the car, he mentioned his grandmom still had keys to their house in Kashmir. Speaking wall, I think, came out of this. The text was written a few years later, and the interactive piece came along after another few years. An outdoor light installation against the sea, which carries stories of movement and change. Shown first at the Dhaka Art Summit, this cluster of works deal with the sense of ambiguity, perpetual statelessness, and entrapment, constituted for those who lived in enclaves, registered upon the formation of national boundaries. Locally known as cheat mahals, where cheat means fragments, enclaves were pockets of India within Bangladesh and pockets of Bangladesh within India. While during interviews, the cheat dwellers retold their predicament, being as a result of their highly fertile lands becoming pawns in a chess game between the two neighboring rulers of the princely states of Cooch Behar and Rangpur, where the former integrated into India and the latter into East Pakistan and then Bangladesh. Historians say, however, the reason for the creation of enclaves was more likely a case of feudal state systems that prevailed pre-partition. For those who lived in one country surrounded by another country, walking in a straight line over a few kilometers or even a few hundred meters over invisible borders in any direction made them illegal. Absence of any identity card meant denial of civic amenities, making subterfuge a way of life in the enclaves, as it is for several others who live on the edges of states. There were 111 Indian enclaves and 51 Bangladeshi. There have been several contradictory population estimates, and you can imagine why. People move, they're afraid to get registered, of which the latest were 51,000. These images are from Kunstwerk, part of the Berlin Biennale, where the work was shown a few years ago. The first work, the image on the right, is a small acrylic on canvas of a screen grab from my phone when I was at the Masaldanga enclave. 2 entries inscribed around the formation of a community, which probably had something more to do with the collection of water here. This is not a low-res image. It's intentionally blurred. 100 fake names to enroll children in the neighborhood school. Depending on which side of this marking you may now be, you may or may not have an identity card. You may or may not need a fake name to enroll into a school. You may or may not be able to deliver your child with the real father's name in the neighborhood hospital. You may or may not still be able to have electricity this evening, even though the cable passes over your house, irrespective of the fact that your family may have lived here before countries were formed one night. I woke up one night and was duly informed that I now lived in a fragment of another country inside a country. From 6:30 p.m. to 5 a.m., every day in darkness, cheat number 111. Scratched on paper, these do not belong anywhere. From one of the interviews, postmen do not deliver at the enclaves, so job letters do not reach us. A drawing of a letter which probably never came. I sent a letter from my studio. I got a phone call that it just reached, but it was not delivered. It was returned. Address not found. Will it be all right if we win? Asked the player in a friendly volleyball game between Masaldanga Cheat and the border security force. The audio of the game has been replaced with that of ambient sounds of the rice fields which span through the region. In September 1958, when Nehru met Noon, the two prime ministers agreed to an exchange of enclaves. There lives a person who was picked up by the authorities when he was working in New Delhi and deported to Bangladesh, and he had to bribe his way across to return to his home here in the Bangladeshi enclave. Border post, ME. I found an extract from the Cooch Behar Rangpur Boundary Commission report, in which a jika tree, a cart track, and bamboos are registered as markers between border pillars. The pillar now. I was at the Deenhatha police station, and in a conversation about movement of goods and people, the word fentanyl came up as one of the often confiscated items. A cough syrup, which is a popular intoxicant, banned in Bangladesh, and of which there are several factories in the border states on the other side. A set of drawings made with fentanyl, codeine-based cough syrup, illegal in Bangladesh and legal in India. On the Awadh Assam passenger train, in a conversation over lunch, a banker on his way to an official weekend retreat enthusiastically says that several banks are opening up branches in the border area due to great cash flow. And indeed, we did see several crisp new banks. I was at the Teen Vigha, a special corridor, and the guard who stood there asked me to put my camera away, firmly saying that only 30 cows are officially authorized to cross over this unique entry-exit point, only on Mondays and on Thursdays. As we moved a few minutes away from this point, hundreds and hundreds of cows stood there grazing in the fields at the border. Places are more porous than on paper. I found this over the internet. An enthusiastic seller of fentanyl who lists his mobile phone, and then he says for his safety, sometimes I switch it off, but otherwise you can SMS him. 4 men, 5 women, and 8 children nabbed at the border, carrying 2,34,930 Bangladeshi taka, 2007 Indian rupees, a few Bhutanese currency, 2 mobile phones, and 17 compact discs. On May 2015, the revised land boundary agreement, first proposed in 1974, was finally ratified, and the legislation for dismantling the enclaves, which had been in existence for more than 6 decades, was finally passed. Upon the swap of the enclaves, contrary to the expectation of the government, only 2% of the people registered to move. A year later, several enclave dwellers who came to the Indian enclaves from Bangladesh expressed a desire to go back to Bangladesh. I'm interested in the ideas of fixity and motion, visibility and invisibility, that constantly surface as incognito objects, traverse a meandering borderline. A borderline drawn across a terrain joined by rice fields, communities, rivers, and several streams, dotted with heavily armed guards at regular intervals. It is here that India is building a fence almost encircling its neighbor Bangladesh, which upon completion would be the world's longest fence, a longest separation barrier between 2 nation states. However, daily life in the borderland belies state intentions, and the flow of people and goods continue, prompted by historical and social affinities, geographical continuity, and the economic imperative. 3 hours and an overnight train journey from a village near Dhaka to Kolkata city, 5 p.m. to 11 a.m., across 2,800 kilometers of fenced border. 300 to the tout, who passes 200 to the customs, 100 saris to sell, to be worn. Here it lies, shredded, carrying narratives of its unlisted passage. Light pierces through a carbon drawing as markers of the brightest light of the night in a landscape which is otherwise barely lit. 1,763.06 kilometers of flood lighting, Department of Border Management, Ministry of India. There seems to exist a contradiction in what the state would like for itself and what its elected representatives would like for themselves. Such was the visibility that I could barely see beyond few meters. A vitrine filled with fog. You stand here, and I walk 20 steps away with this metal pipe and trigger. When it turns dark, we'll not be able to see each other. Does the figure allow willful passage, knowing well that anything otherwise will be futile? I interviewed a person who said his business was import-export. That's a piece of gold. After leaving Jogeshwari, I buy the last-minute ticket at the Bombay Central Station. I take the topmost berth and simply sleep throughout. On the third day, I get off just before the border. It's the most peaceful sleep I get. The gold comes, hidden right here, inside my clothes, just like that. Clandestine routes memorized through this intricately linked region. Drawing made in the dark, 1. Go straight, turn right at the tea stall, and carry on to the main road. Then after the church, you'll see a border post pillar on your left. Walk across the field past another pillar belonging to the other side, and you'll see a shop selling wood. It's the third house from the junction there. Drawing made in the dark, 3. Last time, I had no money to pay extra to the tout, so it took some more time to cross. Drawing made in the dark, 6. Since I'm not a regular, I need to be cautious. It's good to check if there are better bargains in the market on the other side. Sometimes they ignore me and let me pass because I'm a woman. At other times, we risk our bodies. A figure clutches a photograph held up against his face as a claim to land, to mobility. While in the glare of the searchlight, another one has learned to sleep every night. Edited registers of the parliamentary debate appear. The statement, "Nothing will go on record," is announced to the room. It leaves little hope for a letter to be undelivered, which is ultimately found shredded. Witness in denial. The border is part of a larger zone, or the borderland, which at once constructs and subverts the nation. The works look at mobility as an integral part of social lives rather than as an exception. The existence of mobile communities preceded the formation of states. When I was sitting outside the passport office in what looked like a makeshift structure of 2 small rooms, sipping tea, a custom officer candidly admitted that only as far as his vision could travel, the area was under vigilance. The illegal trade is 3 times the legal trade. While hand-woven saris make their way across west, spare motor parts travel east. Unnoticed, images of the border sky, fragmented, spare motor parts. Drawings made in marijuana, growing in the vicinity of the security border post. Drawings of security apparatus used to impede the movement of illicit goods, of desires, of desperation. I'm interested in the distinction between the state as an idea and the state as a real-life organization. The existence of a vibrant subversive economy, be it informal, driven by age-old connections and habits, or those now controlled by syndicates, which transpire invisibly in the open. The state stands rescaled, in the face of individual affiliations, even by its own representatives. There exists a chasm between the largest construct that seeks singularity and its own fragment, which may not. While symbols and grand gestures are paraded at the center of a construct, as we move to the edges, definitions and alignments are blurred, are problematized. Thank you.
Can we dim the lights, please? Hello. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Sharjah Art Foundation, for having me. So I'm going to talk about my practice in general and see how we're doing with time. I'm interested in the problematics that are inherent in the architectural practice itself. For example, the unbridgeable gap between dwelling and architecture or building, a gap that I think was magnified by modernity. This is like on a very general level. On a very specific level, I'm interested in the relationship between construction and land to time, to temporariness that is constantly mutated into a permanent state. In another word, I'm interested in the permanent temporariness. This is in reference to the Palestinian refuge and exile, but also hoping to link or touch on deterritorialization, displacement, and refuge in general. And this question is automatically investigated and tested in sites of particular knowledge, personal and practical knowledge, where I think the personal becomes more of a case study rather than personal history. As an example of these sites, Amman where I've lived most of my adult life. Amman, I think, is the definition of the refuge city. And the permanent temporariness. Of course, some would strongly disagree. But this investigation of the permanent temporariness in space becomes more of a way of seeing, becomes more of a daily practice. And the political and historical inscription of space become a way of seeing. Another site is Nahr al-Barid refugee camp in the north of Lebanon. If you see the dense tear-shaped spot, this is the camp, and then what's surrounding it is the expansion of the camp. Nahr al-Barid was completely destroyed in 2007 after an armed conflict between the Lebanese army and an Islamist fundamentalist group called Fatah al-Islam that took over the camp. And this very unfortunate event, I was lucky to work as an architect and urban planner in the reconstruction project. From the beginning, I had this is the image of the destruction. From the very beginning, I had a critical distance, a good critical distance, I think, from the idea of the camp reconstruction. What does it mean to rebuild a camp? What does it mean to rebuild something that is so elusive in its nature, incremental, and completely desire-driven, need-driven, as opposed to the desire of the designer or the planner? So despite this critical distance, the project held a very strong revolutionary potential within. On a political level, it's the first Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon to be destroyed and to be reconstructed within an official framework. So that is a very important moment. On an architectural or spatial level, it was an opportunity to rethink how things are done in the temporary. How do you, to rethink this idea, spatially and architecturally. There was a very overwhelming promise of the new, standing in the bulldozed land of Nahr al-Barid. A guilty one, I have to say, because you dare to project a dream on this tragedy. But yet, it was very overwhelming. Slowly but surely, the new brought new constellation of power, and the process of the reconstruction became a process that involved the army and the state, and the planning process was triggered by security measures imposed on us by the army. So it was a security planning. So the question transformed from how do you rebuild a camp into how do you live, how do you build, and even how do you die in a state of suspension? How do you build without a land? How do you build without a land became the title of an ongoing project that is composed of several elements dealing with this idea of the impossibility of dwelling in the temporary. Some are poetic, some scientific, but all of them, I think, have a very obsessive undertone. And this idea, rethinking this idea of what does it mean to be at the limit of things or defined by the absence of something. So some are departing from a very particular architectural moment in the 60s. But I would like to focus on one of these elements. And it questions the idea of how do you produce data for the extraterritoriality, which is the case of the camp and case of all Palestinian camps in Lebanon. So the camp had no spatial documentation whatsoever, except for 4 aerial photos, taken in different phases and for different purposes, of course. This one in 1950, 1 year after the establishment of the camp. 1968 or 9, I'm not sure, but a couple of years after receiving the second wave of Palestinian refugees. And this is in 1994, just few years after the Lebanese civil war had ended. And 2007, a very comprehensive, a beautiful take of the camp, very comprehensive, taken during the conflict, just before the bombardment and the total destruction of the camp, which was, by the way, unnecessary because it happened after the conflict was concluded. And the absence of documentation afterwards. So this is something I collected from Google Maps. If you can see, you still can see the trace of the boundary of the camp, and you can see how nature had taken over. And the little corner over there is part of the reconstruction project. So it was very tempting to look at this, to compare these documents. And the first 3 aerial photos show something that that the general rules of aerial photo production were not really respected. Like, for example, the orientation of the north, or the scale, or the definition of the capture. So all of the images were unified, tilted to point to the north, and placed in a unified void, which is a unified piece of paper, basically. And the location of each image indicates direction of flow from and into the camp, centrality, openness at that point of the history of the camp. And then, as you can see, of course, it's a fictional location. It's just a projection. And you can see how the final image is going back to the corner right where it started. And if we look at this line of movement, we can maybe read something about how authority produces information, and we can see how the extraterritoriality is perceived, However, this idea of invisibility of the extraterritoriality, I mean, can be looked at in another way. During the bombardment of the camp, a group of activists and the people of Nahr al-Barid mobilized to document the bombed buildings one by one. Gradually, this process of mapping the destruction, or let's say documenting the destruction, transformed into a mental reconstruction of space. Basically, a process of reclamation of a spatial reality that was never there from the beginning. So it was more of a resurrection of the camp. So detailed social structure, neighborhoods, and later on detailed plans were produced. And this is a detail of one of the maps, and it's basically a juxtaposition between cadastral maps and aerial photos and the mental mapping that took place. And of course, these, this process was validated over so many phases and stages of the process, but this unprecedented document of the camp had basically shifted the direction of the process of reconstruction and forced the Nahr al-Barid people to be part of the reconstruction process. To draw in this process of reclamation of space, a space that is ephemeral, I would like to branch into two other projects. Rahala, or the Traveler, which is somehow an adaptation of the same process of reclamation. It's a process of collecting spaces, architectural typologies, and know-hows of dwelling in suspension and in waiting. Reclaimed from personal memory and experience, those spaces are then recreated, materialized, becoming more of a topographic site, let's say, dare I say an archaeological site, maybe between a point in the past and in the present, of different typologies of architecture of the temporary. So the 1980s, for example, is reclaimed through a residential building in Kuwait as a point of departure that unfolds into other spaces and other forms of migration and exile. By freezing a visual memory of a space, then deconstructing it into angles, materials, and shadows, another layer is revealed, maybe regional references, alienation, attempts to unravel the unknown in a new context, in an unfamiliar context, in the context of processes of modernity and modernization in the host countries, in the processes of nation building in general. So this space becomes not only an extension of Palestinian refuge, I think, but also part of the deterritorialization of working class migrant workers in the region in the region in general. The major tool of this process of reclamation, I think, is the construction of models. Well, there are some drawings, but the model is more present. And the model here, I think, is not a mock-up for something to be built. It's, on the contrary, I think it's an abstraction of a moment in time. It becomes the space. And also, the material here becomes the knowledge, with so many embedded references and migration even of material. The material can be from demolished site, but also can be new, specially carved for this particular model. So these fragments of space, I think, can be seen as side effects of modernity, I think. and each material can, we can relate to each material in a different way, but somehow I try to work with very local material that have very specific reference in a very specific time and space. In the same line, I'm showing now at the Architecture Biennial in Orléans, the same, like an expansion of this project, but I'm focusing more in the juxtaposition between the dwelling in the temporary and the nation-state building in the host country, and what's happening between. You're building the spectacle, but you're never in the spectacle. And how to recognize modernity in the region as the moment of exile and refuge as we know it now. And there's a narrative that is built around two moments, two abstract moments, and what's in between them, of course. The first one is the physical transformation of a pilotis space in a modernist building in Kuwait. The pilotis is, just in case it's it's a concept introduced by Le Corbusier where the volume of the building is raised above columns, so you have a void underneath the main body of the building. So it's the moment of transformation of the pilotis space in an apartment building in Kuwait in the 80s. It's an imagined moment, although it's reclaimed from memory, but it is an imagined one because I don't have any memory of it. And that the transformation, the reason for transformation is, or let's say a typology was produced by this transformation, which was something called informally the annex, which is a space, an extra space to accommodate more people, rent money, etc. So, and this moment, I think, stresses the schism between who builds and who dwells, and look at structure as authority, architectural structure and vision as a source of authority, and look at what happens on the ground. Another moment, this is an archival image from UNRWA archive, and it documents the transformation of Al-Baqa refugee camp in north of Amman in the 1970s. It documents the exact moment where the tent was transforming into modular walls. And so between the 2 points, I'm really interested between the structure as authority, the grid, and the module. And between the grid and the module, both of them I consider as part of this permanent temporaneous investigation, but they both represent totally different things. Do I still have time? Okay. I'm just gonna run through the models also. It's a model-based investigation, but also was displayed with the narrative built through notes and drawings. And all of the models are collages between found material, but also reworked and edited and new, or let's say, produced material. And I'd like to shift to something else and talk about how things change when I do something site-specific. I think I follow the same logic of thinking, but there's suddenly, when it's a site-specific work, something automatically changes regarding scale, regarding how the body is in relation with the work. The body becomes the reference, becomes the unit almost. This was displayed in Marrakesh Biennial, and the title of the work is Time is Measured by Distance, and it's composed of two site-specific works in Al-Badia Palace, which is a ruin, as you can see, Yeah, and it's made of from plaster and cement. The first sculpture is a mutated stairway, and it's basically something about taking a domestic, everyday life element and render it dysfunctional. And it's not dysfunctional because it's horizontal, it's dysfunctional because the DNA is not working as a stairway. And on the opposite side, as you can see, there's a big white mass. This mass is the body of water in the Strait of Gibraltar expanded or extruded as a body. Being in Marrakesh, I think it was the first time for me to look at first time for me to be confronted with the sea as the mass graveyard as it is now. It's the first time I'm confronted with the Mediterranean as the gateway to the north, the problematic way of looking at the Mediterranean, as opposed to experiencing the sea in Beirut, for example. So the Strait of Gibraltar becomes something else, becomes really the focus of this experience, although Marrakesh is not by the sea or anything, but it's something that I felt I had to deal with. And the strait itself is a space of tension because you don't know if it's a space that is closing or opening. So the boundary of the space is retraced, and the body of water in between is extruded, and the height difference represents the difference in height between Jabal Musa and Jabal Tariq on both ends. So the strait becomes the space of possibility, but also not, but the space of the impossibility. While working on this, verse by Al-Mutanabbi was very, very present, which is in Arabic, it's بضدها تتبين الأشياء. In English, it translates to things are better or best recognized by their contraries. So I guess a gate is a gate because it closes. You recognize movement when you are still. You recognize life because of death. So, and I guess between the two of them, between the two elements in this space, I think there's, I wanted to stress how maybe a very simple idea such as, the straight line between 2 points is no longer possible now. So, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for the presentations. And we have a few minutes left that we can have a few questions, and maybe even if there's time, we'll have questions from the audience. Saba, I thought I would start with you, just in a way responding to each other's presentations and the idea of translation as it relates to reconstruction, both in a practical sense with the refugee camp after its destruction, but also thinking about the kind of ideas of the architectural model that can be a kind of a form that you're able to borrow for a sculptural sense. I mean, are you able to just talk about it in a kind of general sense, maybe as it relates to Shilpa's work, or even just reconstruction and translation, and how these, the kind of initial case study goes through various visual formations and then translations into the context of an exhibition per se.
I think there's something very common in the method, let's say, of how a specific knowledge is reclaimed and then translated into the material world. I mean, between two practices. And in case about the model as a tool, I look at the model or borrowing the model as an architectural tool. I look at it as an end result, as an archetype, as a typology that could, I don't know, could hint at a historical moment and be part of a general architectural discourse. So, for example, in the work that I'm showing at the Architectural Biennial, the title of the work is Tomorrow Poetry Will Not Be the House of Life. Sorry for the project, the title of the work, not the biennial. And the title is based on a lecture given by Constant in 1957 about New Babylon, but I negated his proposition. So borrowing, I'm including his drawings and proposition in my work as a critique of his critique of modernity. So I guess by borrowing this very familiar tool or reclamation of the fragment and rendering it visible through the model, I think it's just a way for me to force a particular idea to be in a general discourse of architecture, I think. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, I think that's helpful. And then, Shilpa, would you say, if you could talk a little bit more about the process of kind of translating interviews and these kinds of, that research into what become a type of visual illustration, but perhaps they're functioning in a very different way, but how would you kind of characterize those works in relationship to the initial interviews that you conduct?
So to actually let you know, there are hours and hours of interviews. And for example, if you remember, there was this work with a little piece of gold and this conversation which I spoke about with the person who does import-export between India and Bangladesh. He sort of takes things in and brings gold into India in a subversive way. So we met, we spoke for several days, but I wasn't allowed to record. It's also that in certain places it's okay to record, and actually my handwriting was so bad, I actually had to handwrite like hours of speaking to him. And then in the end, what I would tend to do is I would just close the conversation, close the book, and then see what I would remember the most. While I have so many factual bits of information, how things happen, and how much is going what, where, how much is, what's coming, what's going. What stayed with me in our conversation was when he spoke about sleep, that it was the most peaceful, that when he boarded the train from the Bombay Central Station from Mumbai, and he took off to sort of go on this 3 days journey to the border area, it was the most peaceful sleep he got. So this sense of not belonging, now not here, not there, because even he comes from a specific neighborhood, the Jogeshwari, and is sort of looking after a very large family, and then this kind of a common sleep space that we all sort of inhabit, of not wanting to be here and there. So I sort of allowed my instinct to choose what I would like to, because there's a lot of factual material. Or this line that, speaking for hours about with this young father, and he spoke about in the enclave, that how his children, that on a piece of paper in the school document, it's not his name on the document, it's somebody else's name to get his child into the school, because you can't put your own name, because otherwise you don't have access. And then there was something he spoke about that, because there's a lot of joblessness in that area, or a lot of informal labor, and he said something that, but job letters do not reach us, and that stayed with me. So really, it's totally as to, I didn't have a particular aim as to what, when I went, I just went without a set of questions or without a set of, So I really allowed my instinct to just to see what stayed with me. Because there's hours and hours of material, and what you have is like barely a few minutes, like if you read it all, it's like five minutes, yeah.
And is the voice or the kind of the language that's generated out of the text that accompanies those pieces, is that yours then kind of purely from recollection?
So, well, in the sense of the handwritten text, that, well, maybe there is some amount of translation that would take place because I'm writing it, but like a simple line like postmans do not deliver at the enclave, so job letters do not reach us is probably the closest translation from Hindi to English. So there is not one format, also because there wasn't one format in terms of how, there was somebody I could even speak on the phone without exchanging names or, so there's not one particular format in how the transcription would take place, yeah. Or there would be certain times where, I showed that work with the number of hours, because it would be a 1 hour conversation, and since I was interested in the close proximity between making the journey from a village to a big city in Calcutta, so I sort of got interested in the number of hours, so I would add 28 hours. He didn't count it, so I added that bit to it. So there have been levels of the way the information has come in, or just the pure data from the Home Ministry, so many kilometers of fences. That's something I have inscribed from a more official document, or these other stories of people moving in the dark are stories and fragments from conversations, which are probably not recorded. So there's really no one way, actually, for all the first-person stories, yeah.
And Saba, I mean, I think in some ways you've also kind of evoked the contradictory nature of the work in a way. You've talked about the scientific data as it relates to the poetic. And maybe similarly, but how would you kind of address this as it relates, on the one hand, there's the work that you did with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that deals with data in a very kind of tangible way, perhaps, even though I think you're still dealing with reconstruction through a kind of oral history and narrative in that way, versus the sculptural works that you showed where you have this kind of the fragmentary nature of the work that is, alluding to the architectural model, but then also bringing in different materials that are maybe more, that you're taking liberties with, I guess.
Well, I have to say that most of the existential plight of the work itself came from discussion with the people from Nahr al-Bared, because they were very conceptual in the way they were addressing and enforcing the reconstruction to take in a very particular way. So a lot of this, a lot of the poetic and the scientific and maybe the imaginary came from the community and from also personal narrative. For example, suddenly the return to the camp, the return to the reconstructed camp became a prerequisite for them to the return to Palestine. So somehow they were able to construct their very poetic understanding of the situation. This on one hand. On another hand, in the work I'm doing about with the models in the Traveler and the other work, I'm trying to expand the understanding of dwelling in the temporary beyond the camp. Okay, I've never lived in a camp, but I want to talk about this unrecognized, subtle, permanent temporariness beyond the physicality of the camp. Of course, the camp itself had transformed from the very ephemeral to the concrete. This is a fact, but I want to talk about exile and refuge beyond that, in different trajectories, and even expand more. Okay, I'm referencing a particular narrative, but I want to touch on this deterritorialization and the impossibility of dwelling while you live in the temporary. So, and the fragments of space that I'm trying to build, again, I think, well, it's a work in progress, but I'm hoping at some point that I can reclaim them really part of an architectural know-how and architectural history can be recognized as a narrative, as an actual narrative, and not as contemplations on migration. And because, yeah.
I wonder, for the sake of time, just because we have only a few minutes, if there are any questions from the audience, maybe. Not a one. All right. Well, with that then, maybe we can call it. But thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for coming and for having us here. Ryan, Reem.